17th century was an age of awakening for Europe. The light of the Renaissance illuminated the continent, the invention of the printing press spread ideas, and the great geographical discoveries expanded the known world. Yet, from the Ottoman Empire came a humble drink that unexpectedly transformed European cities: coffee. In the misty streets of London, the elegant squares of Vienna, and the bustling boulevards of Paris, coffeehouses emerged as vibrant centers of social storms. These places offered more than just a cup of coffee. They sparked ideas, rebellions, and revolutions. Merchants, poets, politicians, and restless spirits gathered over the aroma of coffee, challenging monarchies, planting the seeds of democracy, and laying the foundations of a new era. In London, for example, coffeehouses became the hidden chambers where the glorious revolution of 1688 was plotted. Europe's first coffee revolution was not merely the story of a beverage, but of a continent's awakening spirit. Coffee reached Europe in the late 16th century through Ottoman merchants. It first arrived in Venice around 1615, when coffee beans made their way into the city's ports. Traders referred to this exotic drink as the wine of Arabia, marveling at its energizing effects. From Venice, coffee spread rapidly. By the 1640s, the first coffeehouses had opened in Oxford and London. Vienna embraced coffee culture in 1650, followed by Paris in 1669. Yet coffeehouses were far more than simple venues for drinking. They became places that reshaped the very fabric of European society. People flocked to them to debate and converse, free from the drunken atmosphere of taverns. Coffee sharpened the mind, and this awakening created a space where ideas could flow freely. In London, coffeehouses were known as penny universities, for with just a penny's worth of coffee, anyone could share ideas. Merchants, scientists, writers, and politicians gathered in these spaces, discussing everything from trade deals to philosophical debates. One famous example was Lloyd's Coffeehouse, which in the 1680s became the birthplace of a new insurance market, an institution still known today as Lloyd's of London. Yet coffeehouses were not only hubs of intellectual exchange, they were also hotbeds of political intrigue. The glorious revolution of 1688, a turning point that limited the power of the monarchy in England, was shaped in the dimly lit rooms of these establishments over cups of coffee. Opponents of James II met there to plan the revolution's strategy. In this way, coffeehouses became fortresses of free thought beyond the reach of royal censors. In Vienna, coffeehouses were writing a different story. In 1683, when the Ottoman siege of the city failed, coffee culture rose as a symbol of victory. According to legend, as the Ottoman army retreated, they left behind sacks of coffee, planting the seeds of Vienna's first coffeehouses. But this was only the beginning. By the 18th century, Viennese coffeehouses had become the intellectual heart of Austria. Composers like Mozart and thinkers like Freud gathered in these spaces to exchange ideas. Coffeehouses were not merely about a drink, they became carriers of culture, redefining the social life of Europe. In Paris, coffeehouses sowed the seeds of revolution. When Café Procope opened in 1669, Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot met there. It was a place where ideas collided and the revolutionary spirit was forged. Coffee sharpened the mind, and with awakened minds came bold ideas against the monarchy. By 1789, when the French Revolution erupted, coffeehouses had become the very planning grounds of revolutionaries. These establishments were not just cafés, they were laboratories of freedom and change. Coffeehouses played different roles in every corner of Europe. In Amsterdam, they became gathering places for merchants and sailors, where new trade routes were planned and colonial ventures discussed. In Lisbon, coffeehouses blended the culture of coffee with spices arriving from Africa and Asia under the shadow of Portugal's maritime empire. In Krakow, they served as havens for Poland's intellectual resistance. These venues were more than places to drink. They were carriers of culture, redefining the social life of Europe. The social impact of coffeehouses was not limited to intellectuals. The working class, women, and even immigrants found space within them. In the 17th century, women's presence in public life was rare, yet coffeehouses began to challenge that norm. In London, some establishments hosted discussion evenings in which women participated. Immigrants, particularly Jewish and Ottoman merchants, used coffeehouses as places of integration. In Venice, for example, coffeehouses became points of contact between Ottoman traders and Europeans, a meeting ground of cultures, languages, and flavors. Coffee was not merely a beverage, it was a unifying force. Yet coffeehouses were not always welcomed. Monarchies and the church saw them as threats. In England, King Charles II attempted to shut them down in 1675, fearing they were breeding grounds for seditious ideas, but public resistance forced him to withdraw the ban. In Vienna, the Catholic Church denounced coffee as the devil's drink until Pope Clement VIII, after tasting it himself, lifted the prohibition. Coffeehouses thus became arenas of defiance against authority, an element that only heightened their allure. The influence of coffeehouses was not limited to the 17th century. These venues laid the very foundations of modern European democracy. As spaces where ideas could be freely debated, they prepared the ground for the rise of press freedom, public opinion, and civil society. For example, the newspaper culture that emerged from London's coffeehouses expanded access to information for the public. In Paris, coffeehouses spread the ideas of the Enlightenment. These establishments became the driving force behind Europe's intellectual awakening. Centuries later, the echoes of this coffee revolution were still felt, even in the darkest days of the 20th century. During World War II, Winston Churchill ignited the spirit of European resistance. His words, blood, toil, tears, and sweat united the people, while the legacy of the coffeehouses served as a reminder of the power of free thought and open debate. In Berlin, Nazi plots such as Operation Long Jump sought to silence this spirit, yet the seeds planted by the coffeehouses centuries earlier had already strengthened Europe's resilience. Churchill's speeches, much like the debates once held in 17th century coffeehouses, helped sustain the soul of a nation. Coffeehouses thus stood as symbols of freedom and solidarity, tied to Churchill's legacy of resistance. Even after the war, coffeehouses retained their importance in Europe. In the 1940s, London CAFS revived to help people forget the exhaustion of war. In Paris, places like CAF de Floa became centres for existentialist thinkers such as Sartre and Beauvoir. These CAFS carried the legacy of the old coffeehouses, becoming meeting grounds for ideas, art, and freedom. Today, in every corner of Europe, modern CAFS still bear the imprint of that 17th century revolution. Whether in a Starbucks or a small local CAF, the spirit of the coffeehouse has been modernized, but the aroma of that first revolution still lingers in the air. Europe's first coffee revolution was not merely the story of a beverage, but the story of an awakening continent. Coffeehouses were places where ideas flowed freely, authority was challenged, and society was reshaped. From London to Vienna, from Paris to Lisbon, these establishments transformed the very soul of Europe. Today, as we sip a cup of coffee, we still feel the legacy of that revolution, the taste of freedom, debate, and solidarity.